What's up, everyone? My name is Abbas Hussaini, and today we're going to talk about construction contracts by Jimmie Hinze. In this presentation, we're going to talk about Chapter 1, Description of the Construction Industry. But before we talk about that, I'd like to explain why I created this channel and what I hope to do with this and the future presentations. I created this channel because as landscape architects or future landscape architects, we just don't have enough time to study. And when we do have time, it's very daunting to start because this exam has 4 parts and each part has about 4 dense books. And so what I'm doing is creating these presentations in order to go in depth in these books, read these books, take a lot of notes, and create these presentations so you're able to study with it in a different way. But that doesn't mean that you can't sit down and look at these presentations and take notes and study that way, because I try to make these presentations as dense as possible and as equivalent to the books as possible, because I wanted this to be almost as a substitute for a book. I know it's not an exact substitute because I can't put it word for word, but I try to make as close as possible where I'm not leaving anything important out. So now that we have that out of the way, let's begin. So this chapter will basically give an overview of the construction industry. Some of the things that we'll talk about is the construction industry versus the manufacturing industry. What are the similarities and what are the differences? Then we'll talk about the economy in the construction industries and also public versus private construction. What are the differences? How do they get the funds to fund these projects? And then we'll talk about, the different categories of the construction industries. As you can see, there's 4. Then we'll talk about the project development process. This is basically seeing as, how does someone decide to build a project and what are the steps he takes in order to build that project. Then we'll talk about some review questions that are in the book, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can because the review questions really help you think critically about this chapter. It puts 2 and 2 together. It helps you understand more. So, manufacturing versus construction. Manufacturing is basically mass production, and production is done at one location, for example, factories. If we look at something that's mass produced like the iPhone, everything is quantified, everything is accounted for. It just goes through this treatment train process where it's built. But the construction industry is very, very different. In the construction industry, it's mostly custom built projects, and if there is any standardization, it's in prefabricated components like like the tiles. The tiles are prefab, but overall the project, it's very custom. Another difference is the location changes with every project. In manufacturing, it's done with factories. In construction, projects are built into different areas. Construction projects are complex and complicated in nature with different crafts. The reason this is because these projects require 10 to 15 crafts. This can be, contractors, subcontractors, specialty contractors, architects, engineers, surveyors, all these things. And when you have 10 to 15 different crafts, when you have so many different professions working on it, naturally there's going to be some efficiencies and some errors. Now that doesn't mean that these projects will fail. It just means that in comparison to manufacturing, there's more errors in the construction industry. So let's look at the size of the construction industry. There's a direct relation between annual construction volume and GDP, which is gross domestic product. There's also a direct relation between employment rate and construction industry employment rate. The construction industry is about 5% of GDP, and construction volume is mainly new construction. The remaining includes maintenance, repairs, and renovations. As you can see in the graph to the right, new construction is about 64.7% of the overall construction volume. Repair and maintenance, renovation, remodeling is the remaining percentage. So when we look at this graph to the left, we can see that manufacturing, because they have everything dialed in, because everything is prefab, not a lot of time is wasted. Everything is accounted for. Versus in the construction industry, like I said, about more than 50% of the time is wasted in lulls because there's so many professions involved. Naturally, there's going to be some errors, there's going to be some redos on certain things, there's going to be just human error. naturally there's going to be some errors, there's going to be some redos on certain things, there's going to be just human error. So let's look at the disadvantages of the construction industry. We can see that construction is seasonal, especially with highway work and heavy construction. Places like Denver, Colorado, you get the 4 seasons, and when you get the 4 seasons, you can't really build when it's snowing, when it's raining, which makes it seasonal. There's also low wages in construction because there's no unionization. There's limited employment opportunities during certain periods of time. Also, another disadvantage is that the unemployment rate of construction is double of other industrial workers because the weather determines if they're going to work or not, versus manufacturing. Since it's done in factories, employment can be year-round. So what happens in construction when there's a recession and when there's an economic boom? When there's economic boom, when everyone's doing well, when there's a lot of work, there's more construction. And this is because the construction industry is a quick response to the economy. We'll talk about this more in the future slides. When there's a recession, however, companies try to compete with each other, they try to low bid each other, and when they do that, there's obviously not much profit to them. And when they're not making enough profit, and those companies that get outbid, they lose their companies, or they find themselves in a position where they don't have work. And when they don't have work, their business fails. So why is the construction industry an easy entry industry? First of all, the industry responds quick to economic shifts. This means when the economy is doing well, there's more construction, and when the economy is down, there's less construction. Another reason is that it doesn't require a lot of capital to start a project, and the companies that are established, they have little advantage over new companies because there's just not a lot of advantage. The companies that are established, that are doing work already, they don't have an edge versus new companies. Most states have no rigid licensing requirements, and companies can be formed for a single project. So in conclusion, the construction industry is an easy entry industry because it responds quick to economic shifts, there's low capital requirements, companies that are established, they don't have an advantage over new companies, most states don't require rigid licensing, and companies can be formed for single projects. Now, what are the reasons companies fail? There are many reasons companies fail. Over-execution of resources is one. Subcontractor defaults. This is when a subcontractor basically fails to do his job. Another reason is bad insurance to cover major losses. This is when a company is in the middle of building a project and a tornado comes and levels the ground. Now the contractor goes to the insurance company naturally, but the insurance company says that we don't cover tornadoes, and so they basically go bankrupt. Companies can also fail when there's errors in estimating. When this happens at a larger scale and they can't come up with those funds on their own, the project defaults and the company fails. Companies can also fail when there's a death and departure of key company officers. Companies can fail when there's inadequate labor or inadequate managerial experience. Inadequate labor when the worker doesn't know what he's doing, he wastes time, he misuses the resources, and managerial experience when the manager doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know how to manage his time, doesn't know how to manage his worker, the company naturally fails. And managerial experience when the manager doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know how to manage his time, doesn't know how to manage his worker, the company naturally fails. Another reason companies fail is acts of God. And this is when natural disasters happen, like hurricanes, tornadoes, or earthquakes. Companies can fail that way. When we look at if they have bad insurance coverage and acts of God happen, naturally they're going to fail. A final point is that failure is more likely to happen to new firms, and this isn't just the construction industry. This is in any industry in general. Most construction companies are small. 80% employ 10 or less workers, and 65% of that employ 1 to 4 workers. Contractors are resource managers of time, labor, material, equipment, and money. This is a very important point because when you have a contractor, it's more than likely that the person that you're dealing with, they're not building the project. They have people that work for them, so they're managers. and they have to, what they have to manage is time. How much time it takes for the people to work, to do certain things, how much time should be allocated for different things, the labor, how many people are needed for the task, the materials, how much the materials are going to cost, how much extra should they order, the equipment, whether it's rental or if they have to buy it, and money. Money is not just how much the project will cost, it's also doing the math on how much time it takes to build a project, how much money it takes to provide labor for that project, to pay those workers, buying the materials and equipment as well. But the biggest resource for contractors is labor, and it's always fluctuating. It's fluctuating because, the construction industry is seasonal. In December, you don't have a lot of work, versus in the summer, you have a lot of work, but there might not necessarily be a lot of workers available to get those tasks done, so projects get pushed behind. So now let's look at public versus private construction. Construction is financed by government agencies in municipalities and counties, state, and the federal level. These projects include highways, bridges, sewers, water supplies, land reclamation projects, and public buildings. An important note on this is that private projects are 68% of the total construction volume, and public projects are the remaining 32% of the construction volume. Before we continue, I'd really appreciate it if you could like this video and subscribe to the channel. These presentations take a long time to create, and I really want to be helping as many people as possible. And the only way that I know that this is helping people is when I get engagement, when I get subscriptions, letting me know that I should continue making these videos. So how are private and public projects funded? Let's look at private funding first. Private funding can come from existing capital. This is capital that the company already has. It can come from direct loans from outside creditors like banks and investors. It can come from sale of fixed assets, issuance of additional shares of stock, issuance of corporate bonds, and endowments. Now the last 4 bullet points are for these larger companies that do have stocks and bonds. Endowments are basically assets of the organization that is invested to earn income, like investing in hedge funds, private equity, real estate, etc. Now public funding comes mainly from taxes. It can come from general taxation, special taxation for a specific purpose, bonds that are issued for specific purposes, and endowments. So let's look at public and private funding allocation. Now I know these 2 pie charts have a lot of information, but the only things that you need to take away is that public funding allocation, the majority of it goes to highways and streets and education, and private funding allocation mainly goes to new single-family housing, which is 48%. So there are 4 construction categories, and these can be in private sector or the public sector. The first one is housing construction. These are residential housing. Some of them can be public, but most are private. The second is building non-residential construction. These are institutions, educational centers, light industrial, commercial, social, religious, farm, amusement, and recreational projects. The third is engineering construction. So these are all constructions that are done by engineers, and they're designed by engineers as well. Some of these projects are water treatment plants, water mains, canals, levees, tunnels, bridges, streets, highways, airports, mass transit, and railroads. The fourth is industrial construction. Industrial construction is basically manufacture and production of commercial products or services. These projects include paper mills, petroleum refineries, steel mills, chemical plants, smelters, electric generator stations, etc. An important takeaway is that in a recession, there are more public projects and less private projects, and when there's a booming economy, it's the opposite. So looking at this pie chart, we can see that housing projects are 35%, which is the largest chunk. Second comes in at a tie between industrial and non-residential buildings at 25%, and the remaining 15% is engineering projects. Looking at the construction employer, we can see that more than 2 million are self-employed. But the real numbers may be lower because employees are classified contractors by firms to avoid paying Social Security, Medicare, workers' compensation, and other taxes. When we look at the construction workforce, we can see that it's dominated by men and minorities. The average age is 39 and they're mostly Hispanic. And wages have slowly declined by 30% because there's not much unionization in this industry. So now let's look at the project development process. Let's say the economy is doing really well and a developer wants to build more houses. Before he does that, he must consider a couple of factors. These factors are financing, the location, market sales, etc. And once he considers these factors, he has to decide whether the risk is worth the return. And once he decides that it's worth the risk, he has to look into financing. If he has the funds, he'll continue with the process. If he doesn't have the funds, he has to come up with a business plan to entice investors to build this project. And once he has the funds, the project can begin. Now, if he doesn't have a location already, he has to find one. Then he must move into hiring designers, and these can be architects, landscape architects, engineers, etc. And once he hires these professionals, they begin the construction document process and permitting. Once the construction documents are approved and all the permits have been obtained, then the building begins. Now that we're done with the presentation, we can go over some review questions. These review questions are really important because they allow you to think critically of the notes you've taken and come up with the answer on your own. The LARE exam isn't a term and definition exam. It's more complex in that it has single answers, multiple answers, and they try to ask questions to test your overall understanding of landscape architecture. To help with that, I formatted these questions so you can attempt to answer the questions before I give the answer to you. As you can see, the question is to the left and the slide where you can find the answer is to the right. So now you can pause the video and go back to find the answer. Okay, so now let's go to the answer. So question 1. List several measures that describe the size of the construction industry. There's more than one answer to this question, meaning there are several answers. There's a direct relationship between annual construction volume and GDP, and we know that GDP is the monetary value of all goods and services produced in a given year in a country. There is also a direct relation between employment rate and construction. Construction is about 5% of GDP, and so if GDP is down, overall construction will be down as well. Another way we can measure the size of the construction industry is to look at construction volume. Mainly new construction because it makes a larger portion of the construction volume. The rest is maintenance, repairs, renovation, and remodeling. Construction also employs about 5 to 6% of the industrial workforce. And finally, this won't be found in the slides, but this is a good point to keep in mind. The construction industry has made a significant impact on the Earth's surface. Naturally, as the population increases, we need more room, more houses, more workspaces, and we need to expand overall. So now let's look at question 2. What construction-related measures can be used to describe the strength of the US economy? And the answers to this can be found in slides 4, 10, 6, and 14. We know that there's a direct relation between construction and the economy. So if the economy is doing well, there's more construction and vice versa. And if overall construction is down, that means the economy is not doing so well. And if the economy is not doing so well, there'll be more remodeling, renovations, which means it'll be a weak economy, and overall construction will be down. We can also look at the total expenditure of construction in the private sector. The private sector makes 68% of overall construction, which means that if construction is up in the private sector, most likely the economy is doing well. But the best measure is looking at new housing construction projects because developers are more likely to develop new houses if they know that the economy is doing well because they'll know that more people are likely to buy houses. And if the economy is not doing so well, they won't build more houses because they know that chances are people won't buy new houses in a bad economy because they're more likely to save their money than spend. And a final measure to look at is the total building permits issued. More building permits issued, that means the economy is doing well, there's more construction, and if it's not, there'll be less building permits issued. Under what conditions might the funding of public construction projects be particularly high? The answer to this can be found in slide 14. So we know that from the previous answer, private construction makes up about 68% of overall construction, and public construction is the other 1/3. So what has to happen for public construction to go up and private construction to go down? And this happens during a recessionary period because in a recession, private projects are less likely to take place because there's so much uncertainty and people just don't develop more because they know that people won't buy houses, they won't rent out buildings. That's when the government comes in, where they allocate more funds for public construction projects in order to create more jobs to keep these companies afloat. This is when these firms switch from private projects to public projects in the low economy because they know that there's more jobs in the public sector. And so there's an inverse relation between public and private construction funding. Question 4. Why is the construction industry referred to as an easy entry and easy exit? This one's a little bit more straightforward and it can be found in slide 7. So there's multiple answers to this. When there's high growth rate in construction, the industry responds quickly to economic shifts. There's not a lot of capital required to enter this industry, and large investments are only required for larger equipment. There's also little absolute cost or profit advantage for established firms. This means that established firms that have been around for a while don't necessarily have an edge over new firms because the most valued asset are the employees. Also, most states have no rigid licensing requirements, and companies can be formed for a single project. Question 5. What are the ramifications of the cyclic tendencies experienced in the construction industry? The answers to this can be found in slides 5, 3, and 6. So there's two conditions that make the construction industry cyclic, and that's weather and economy. Weather makes construction seasonal and geographic because in months like December, when it's raining, when it's snowing, there's no construction being done because you just can't do it. And so owners must plan ahead and award contracts in the springtime to finish before this harsh weather. Since we know that there's a direct relation between the construction industry and the economy, we know that when the economy is up, there's more construction, and when the economy is down, there's less construction. In a recession, there's more competition because there's fewer projects, and as a result, there is decreased profit margins causing some businesses to fail. And when the economy is doing well, there's less competition and more profits. Question 6. Contrast financing of public versus private construction projects. The answer to this can be found in 10, 12, 13, 14. So what this question is asking is how is public and private construction projects funded and what are the differences? So the main thing that you should know is that public projects are funded through taxation. Small projects are funded by regular operating funds and existing funds obtained through taxation, and larger projects require special taxation for specific purposes. And these funds are generated in municipalities, counties, and the state level. Federal funds are also available in certain instances if requirements are met. In case of parks and public buildings, bonds can be issued or endowments can be created. Now in private projects, funds are a little bit different. Funds can be from liquid assets, sale of assets. Funds can also be provided by lenders like loans from creditors and banks, and larger companies can issue additional shares of stocks, they can sell bonds, and they can create endowments. Question 7. Give examples of publicly financed building construction projects and publicly financed non-building construction projects. The answer to this can be found in slide 14. So this is pretty straightforward. Publicly financed building construction projects are anything that's public, like public schools, university, libraries, fire station, anything that's a building. Publicly financed non-building construction projects are projects like highways, bridges, canals, airports, harbor structure, dams, etc., etc. Question 8. Contrast typical construction projects with the production of manufactured goods. The answer to this can be found in slide 3. So what this question is asking is, what's the difference between construction projects and manufactured projects? It's a pretty straightforward answer. Manufacturing goods are mass-produced. There's more quality control because of standardization, and production is done at one location. However, construction projects are custom-built projects, which means that there's some standardization like prefabricated components, like tiles, certain stone veneers, and other components. It's also different from manufacturing in that the location changes with every project. It's complex and complicated with different crafts being involved. Any given construction project, there can be up to 10 to 15 different crafts involved. For example, contractors, subcontractors, masons, engineers, architects, landscape architects, and surveyors. Inefficiencies are also very common because since there's so many crafts involved, naturally there will be human error. Question 9. What would be some key indicators in the construction industry that conditions are improving during an economic slump? The answers to this can be found in slides 4 and 14. So we know that when there's an economic slump, construction is down. And when the economy is up, there's more construction. So what is a key indicator in the construction industry that tells you that conditions are improving and the economy is getting better? The answer to this is the number of new housing starts. This is because when the economy is improving, developers know that people are more likely to buy houses, so they develop more land to create more houses. Another indicator is that there's a decrease in unemployment in the construction industry. When there's more construction, when conditions are improving, when the economy is getting better, people are getting more jobs. And overall, there's a rise in commercial spending because we know that in a good economy, people are more likely to spend. Explain why the different sectors respond differently in terms of timing. Now, the answer to this can be found in slide 14, but you have to think critically about it. It's not a straightforward answer. In general, we know that economic conditions reflect the availability of funds and the willingness to spend them. Projects in the residential sector are pretty straightforward and they have a faster turnaround from commercial sectors and the industrial sector. Now, projects in the commercial sectors are a little bit more complex because it relies on several individuals and they have a delayed and lengthy design phases. They're not so quick to respond because of this. And finally, projects in the industrial sector are the largest of projects, so naturally they take longer to build, which means they're the slowest to respond to the economy. So that's it for this presentation. I hope this was helpful to you. I hope you got something out of it. I want to be doing more of these videos, and if this was helpful to you, please like this video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.